Okay, you guys all done, or where are you guys? How many people are still doing the questions? Good, you're all done. Good, good, good. No, now you guys can turn around. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead and turn around so you don't hurt your neck. Everybody, how's the camera? Good? No, the camera's high enough. It'll be fine. I need to move. This way? Okay, good. I had to get out of the screen, so. Okay. Huh? Yeah. Well, usually it's right somewhere around here. Oh, my spotlight. Oh, it's kind of there, but can you guys see me? I know I'm dark, but. Okay, so I guess I should. There's been a bit of question. There's a couple of questions came on, and people asked me to on live stream asked me to talk about it. We kind of in the email we hinted that we're leaving, and we're leaving. We're going to Idaho. Not because we're running away, but because for two. Actually, it turns out there's multiple reasons. We actually had only considered two of the reasons. One was I've not been able to get a job in 3 years, which is very interesting, because before I would just go for an interview and I would immediately get hired. In fact, people would compete for me. So I thought, oh, maybe I'm getting old, I'm losing it. But my wife said, oh, you should talk to this lady, and I chatted with her. She said, no, there's a blacklist in Silicon Valley. Because I would get interviewed all the way up. I'd get VPs at well-known companies saying, oh, yeah, we got to create a position for you. And then 2 days later, HR would call me back and say, oh, we've decided to move with another candidate. I'm like, there is no other candidate. You're creating a position for me. You know, apparently they didn't tell you what's going on. And she said, no, yeah, we're moving. We're going to go ahead with another candidate. I'm like, okay. I know what's going on, right? So my background is I've done a lot of venture funding. I've done 4 startups, raised about $88 million in venture funding and all that stuff. So it's apparently there is something out there. But maybe, or either that, I've just lost my touch. So, but in either case, it made sense for us to conserve our finances and move somewhere that was not as expensive. So we chose Idaho. End of June. However, because most of you know I work with the VAC, the board of directors has said, no, you will have to fly back every time there's a VAC event. So I will be back once a month for the VAC. In fact, I'll be booking my tickets for all the events that we know that I've planned. You absolutely can. We have 2 acres. And we're actually building. So a bit of our hope for Idaho, we're about 10 minutes from Boise State. So we want to kind of do, my wife has an idea of starting a soup night for the students, where they come over to the house and hang out and have soup, and we talk theology. So that's one. Second thing is we want to start these classes. We're thinking, since we have 2 acres, we're thinking of building a large barn that can hold about 100 people, and then having classes right there, putting a volleyball court right next door and things like that. So, I mean, you can do a lot of things with 2 acres, and we're not in any HOA, so we can pretty much put a barn anywhere we want. So, because next door are horses, right? So the people next door has a barn, they have horses. My daughter's like, oh, we can go over there and ride or take care of them. I'm like, yeah, go for it. So, but I will have to buy a big one of those riding lawnmowers.
That's my first car.
Yeah, there you go. So, but I've been looking at those remote control ones. So anyway, so that's the plan. Also, Boise is where California was about in the 80s, where there are lots of good churches, but none of them are getting involved in politics. So we actually connected with a bunch of people there who are very eager to either start a new church or start the equivalent of a VAC. So we would start VAC Boise over there. This would become VAC San Jose. We are already starting a VAC Ventura in Ventura County with a church down there with Sam Gallucci, who ran for governor and wants to start something there. So we'll see. Hopefully the VAC will now start expanding. You will get an email about the VAC expansion ideas. We're just starting to work on that. So anyway, so that's the background of it. So these classes, once we get started there, we'll be live streaming these classes again from there. So, and then we'll start from the beginning. So those of you who missed those or thought we went too fast will will know it. Anyway, so that's the update. So let's start. As we start, let me ask a trick question. Do you have constitutional rights? How many people think you have constitutional rights? Okay, great. We'll come back to that shortly. Well, a few years ago, I wrote a book called Jesus is Involved in Politics. Why aren't you? Why isn't your church? And actually, my daughter just brought a few copies of it, so we do have them in the back, but you can go on Amazon too. Do not get the ebook version, because that is about 6 years old. This new version is updated. I have not updated the Kindle version for some good reasons, but anyway, so this book was really controversial, as you can see, because it kind of attacks pastors and asks them why they weren't involved in politics. So I came out with a kindler, gentler version that didn't scare pastors as much, and it's called 40 Days Towards a More Godly Nation. You know, no pastor can resist the 40 days at the beginning of a of a book. Not that it's been that successful, but it has a 6-week study guide. You go through it 6 weeks, and you read about 3-4 pages a day, and you get through the bulk of it. But it gives you the same principles. But this is what I call the wimpy version. In the first version, I kind of name names and I beat up people. In this version, I'm just kind of nice and I don't mention any real names. But you know who I'm talking about. So it depends on which people are like, which one should I buy? Well, are you hardcore? You want the first one. If you're going to buy it for somebody who isn't sure about it, you want to buy them the second one. Because it's a bit more tolerant, if you know what I mean. Not really, but okay. So what led me to write these books? Well, most of you who've been here kind of know I was born at a very young age in Ghana. Some of you are thinking that's a town in Texas. It's actually a country just off the west coast of Africa. My parents are Christian Indians, and they heard the gospel from my ancestors heard the gospel. My parents heard the gospel. No, my ancestors heard the gospel from Doubting Thomas, and we have the Marthoma Church there, which continues till this day. So we date our heritage back to him in 51 AD. Funny story, when I first met my in-laws, my father-in-law is a pastor, and so when we first met, he said, so now tell me, how long has your family been Christians? And I said, well, a lot longer than yours. Because see, Christianity came to Britain. They're British, British Americans. Christianity came to Britain like in the 900 AD or something like that. Oh man, we were already Christians by then. So I was born in Ghana, but I grew up in Jamaica, Ethiopia, India, Yemen, and Sudan. And yes, I know you're thinking Sudan, Neil, is really a town in Texas. You're right. There it is, Sudan, Texas. Right past the Dairy Queen. Take a left on Highway 84, and there it is. But that's not the Sudan I grew up in. The Sudan I grew up in is in Africa, as you can imagine. It's back here right below Egypt. And in fact, they speak Arabic there. So I used to speak a little bit of Arabic, but forgot it all once I came here and started watching Star Trek in English. Now you're probably wondering, now, how come I travel so much? Was I a spy? No, I was really young. I couldn't be a spy. But I do look like one when I grow a beard. I look like a terrorist, actually. So, and if you think about it, I lived in Sudan and Yemen. Now, Sudan and Yemen both are terrorist hotbeds, right? So a few years ago, I think it was around 9/11 when all that stuff was happening in Sudan and Yemen, I expected a knock from the CIA or the Department of Homeland Security, excuse me, we need to talk to you. But fortunately, that they didn't do that. But anyway, the reason we were traveling all over the world is because my father was a professor in physics. And we'd go to all these different universities and work for those governments. So basically, we were mercenaries, but educational mercenaries. And the reason I tell you all this is because I want to give you an introduction to the first time I tried to come to the U.S. Many years ago, my dad was a professor in physics. He was at the University of Yemen in Sana'a. Sana'a is a country under Sharia law. Women wear burqas. And Dad had been working there for about 6 years and planned to continue working there for a few years longer. I was about 18 years old, and I knew at the age of 18 there had to be more to women than this. And for most of those 18 years, I dreamt about coming to the United States to go to college. I mean, the United States was the land of my destiny. It was the land of my dreams. It was the land of my heart. It was the land of some very, very beautiful women. And so I determined I had to come to America and meet some beautiful women. And I did that. And I found the most beautiful woman in the world and convinced her to marry me. And there she is. And those are not our kids. Those are the flower girls, just in case you're wondering. But a professor's pay in Yemen is not really sufficient to pay out-of-state tuition in America, probably even less so now. But if my dad figured out that if we dug into their savings and he continued working at the University of Yemen, then we would, making the same salary, we could squeak by and I could come to the States. So we made our plans. Back then. There was no email, or there was something called a telex machine, right? And then faxes were just coming in. And so we did all that. We got my tickets ready. We got everything ready. And I was supposed to leave in about 2 months to go to America. And I got admitted to a university here. So about 2 months before I was supposed to leave, my dad walks in one day, comes home early, and sits us all down and basically tells us that he's been fired. Not only that he's been fired, but we have to leave the country. It turns out that a fellow professor had committed suicide. And when they went into the professor's bedroom, on his nightstand was a Bible with my father's name on it. Now, my dad didn't even remember loaning him, so he thinks that he just took it from his desk at work. And it turns out that my dad knew some people, some of his students had graduated and gotten involved in the government. And so they came to him and said, look, we can buy you 2 weeks before the mullahs come after you. Why? Because it's illegal to give someone who's not a Christian a Bible in Yemen. You see, in Islamic countries, you don't have any unalienable rights. You don't have the right to talk to others about religion or politics, and you certainly don't have the right to give a Muslim a Bible. So where do these rights come from? In Yemen, the government grants you your rights. The right to talk to others about your religion is not one of the rights that they grant you. I used to talk to folks who thought, oh, that will never happen in America. But in the last few years, I don't have to. In fact, there's another 5 minutes of this where I spent time convincing people that that could happen in America. And most of the time, people believe it. A really funny story. If you read the first chapter of my book, it's all about what is to come. I loaned the book to a young man that I was discipling, and he says, I read your book. It's very interesting, but the first chapter is kind of silly. I said, why is it silly? He says, because it's supposed to be alarming, and it's not alarming. I said, oh. So I went back and looked at it, because I hadn't looked at it in a few years. I'm like, oh, yeah, it's not alarming, because all of these things have come to pass. So I got to go back and change it in some way. So we're seeing that happening. So let me ask you this. Do our rights come from the government? No, everybody knows that our rights come from the government. Let me ask you this. So what are the dangers if our rights came from the government? They can take them away, right? In fact, they can legally, if the rights came from government, then they could legally, ethically, morally, and justly take them away, those same rights, for any made-up reason, like for your safety. And what have we been seeing that? Yeah, right? What have we been seeing that in the last few years? In fact, governments all over the world take away rights and give rights at will. So we see it's immediately very dangerous if rights come from government. If you think about it, the only way government can give you rights or take away your rights is through the threat of violence, right? That's their only claim to fame, is we can hurt you if you don't observe our rights. So it's not a moral authority. Okay, so rights don't come from the government because it's not morally correct. Okay, can I give myself rights? Can I walk around saying I'm emperor? You all have to bow down before me. I could, but you're not going to obey it, right? So I'm not really getting anything. So why can't I do that? Because I don't have what over you? Authority. I don't have authority over you. So I've got to have authority over you to give rights. Okay, well, can I get rights from the masses? Now, a lot of people think that you can get rights from the masses. And in fact, when I talk with people on the left, well, not only fickle, it is the same as government. And when I talk to people on the left, they say, oh, yeah, masses give you rights. In fact, one person said, oh, yeah, we get our rights from a social contract. And I said, a social contract? So the slaves had a social contract? Yeah, I'll be your slave and you'll be my master. Here, sign here. No, they kept them there by violence, right? So the slaves were not under any sort of contract. They were forced to be there. Now, this is what, can the masses vote to give people rights? This is what is called a democracy. Our founding fathers called the democracy what? They called it a mobocracy. Our founding fathers called the democracy a mobocracy. Why? Because they thought that was the most dangerous form of government. Because why? Because a few people can then decide, 51% can decide what to do with 49%. Right? And as the founding fathers say, and we'll see that in 2 weeks, I think as Franklin said, a democracy is two wolves and a sheep deciding what's for dinner. And then the answer was, not unless the sheep is armed. Not if the sheep is armed, right? Okay, so, but the point is that here's how you refute this, and I refute this all the time. I run to people and say, oh, no, rights come from the masses, it's a democracy. I say, okay, great. So that means that before the 1800s, when the slaves had no rights, that was okay. And I paused. I said, what do you mean? I said, no, it was wrong. I said, no, so you're saying it was okay. He said, no, I'm not saying. I said, but the entire world thought slavery was okay as long as they were not the slaves. Right? So did that make slavery okay? And then, and here's the worst part of it, if you say the masses give people rights, that means when the white folks make slavery illegal, they were actually giving slaves some rights out of the kindness of their hearts. Now we all know that's garbage. Isn't it true that what was happening is that the slaves always had rights, but these rights were being unjustly violated, and it wasn't until the majority in the state recognized these pre-existing rights that justice was achieved. Yes. So the rights did not come from the masses. And they can't come from the masses. So if they had those rights already, where did those rights come from? They can only come, in reality, from somebody who has what? The authority to grant rights. In fact, who is the only person that has authority, and we're going to come right to that, who's the only person who has authority over Hitler and says, you have to treat the slaves equally, has authority over the, Hitler tell you have to treat the Jews equally, has authority over the slave master and says you have to treat the slaves equally, who is the only person who has authority over every single human being and says every single human being has to treat each other human being equally? Who's that? The Creator. What is the Declaration of Independence says? We hold these truths to be what? Self-evident. That all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their what? The government. Their people. The people, like social contract. Themselves. No, by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That amongst these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What? And you know the thing. You know the thing. Sorry, that's Biden. For those who don't know, Biden kind of messed it up. Now, here's the question, though. Did I use the Bible to come to this conclusion? I use logic and reason to come to this conclusion. That's why it says we hold these truths to be what? Self-evident. These are self-evident truths. Now, what's funny about it, or what's interesting about it, is that this idea, people go, oh, see, Jefferson got this idea from the Enlightenment. Jefferson had this idea, and he was a very wise, and now Jefferson was a wise man. He did some silly things here and there, but he was a wise man. But he didn't get this idea from anyone. He didn't come up with this idea. He got this idea from, you know who? From pastors. From pastors for the last 200 years. Yeah, there was some in Locke, but this, he copied from these sermons. In fact, I do a presentation where I show you the sermons, and I show you the Declaration of Independence. And you go, oh, wait. Those are almost the same words. For 200 years before the Declaration of Independence was written, pastors in pulpits just like this were preaching that rights come from God. In fact, you can go all the way back to the Magna Carta. So rights come from the Creator, or rights come from God. Now this is very important. And this makes logical sense. Now remember the question. The trick question was, do you have constitutional rights? Folks, you don't have constitutional rights. I don't mean you lost them. You never had them because the Constitution doesn't give you any rights. In fact, if you read the Constitution, you will see there's not a single right that you're given, except there was one, the right to vote, that was badly written. But every one of them is a right that the government does not have. It's a list of negative rights. A really funny thing, I was talking up north a couple of weeks ago, and I said this, and afterwards, there was a lawyer in the room, and he wrote in his comments, well, that's not true, because the 6th and the 7th items in the Bill of Rights actually give you rights. And the guy who was telling me this, I said, wait, what is the 6th and the 7th? Because I don't remember them all. He goes, right to trial by jury and right to face your accuser. I'm like, this guy, and this guy's a Jewish lawyer. I said, oh, you think the Constitution came up with that? Has he ever read Exodus? Both of those are in Exodus, right? And Leviticus. You have a right to face your accuser, and you have a right to a jury of your peers. Don't use that word, but there is exactly the same thing, right? Where did it come from? It came from God. So even when they think it comes from the Constitution, it didn't. And all it's saying is that you have the right not to be what? Persecuted unjustly. It's a list of negative rights. Now here's something we should never forget. It's not just any God, right? It is only the biblical God. The biblical creator gives you unreasonable right. Now, because, I've grown up all over the world. I've lived in all the different countries, right? In Sudan, it was the Muslims, right? In India, it's the Hindus and Buddhists. And in India, we have everything there, right? So all sorts of religions there. But if you look at, and I made my point to study all these religions, but the Muslim God certainly doesn't give you any rights, right? If you're not a Muslim, you have no rights. If you're not a man, you have no rights or lesser rights. What, Saudi Arabia finally is letting women drive? Okay, so how about the Hindu gods? There's multiple gods in India, in Hinduism. None of them give you rights because what? You have the caste system in India, right? So you don't get rights from the Hindu God. And Buddhism has no God. So it's atheism, so you have no God in atheism. And so therefore you don't have rights. So it's not only the biblical creator, but it is not only a creator, but the biblical creator gives you unalienable rights. So if you have no Bible, no creator, you have no unalienable rights. So I got there logically, but guess what religion or what holy book is the one that itemizes this, and where did this idea of unalienable rights come from? They come from the Bible. Okay, so we know the rights come from God, but then why do I need a government? Exactly. What does the Declaration of Independence say? The next line says what? That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. So what is the purpose of government? The purpose of government is not to give you rights, but to ensure and protect the rights that you already have. It's not supposed to do anything else. Government is not there to take care of you. Government there is not there to feed you. It's not there to give you health care. It's only there to stop you from being killed by a bad person within the country, outside the country, being stolen from, being what? All your rights. You think of, I have the right to something. Well, then the government is there to protect that right. Now, and by the way, there's only two things the government's supposed to do. One is to protect your rights from unalienable rights, from enemies without and within, and to enforce contracts, which is really a subset of protecting your rights. So if you make an agreement with someone, the government steps in to make sure you enforce that contract. Okay. So what do we know? You can't separate politics from lawmaking, right? Politics is all about lawmaking. So if you can't separate politics from lawmaking, you can't separate lawmaking from morality. Right? When we did the thing on objective morality, we did a class on objective morality. We said morality results in lawmaking, right? You have to legislate some morality somewhere. So the question is, whose morality do you legislate? We won't cover it here, but it's in one of the videos. Okay, so if you can't separate lawmaking from morality, because it's immoral to violate someone's rights, then you can't separate morality from moral authority. Remember when we did that, we showed that we have a moral authority. In other words, the only way that you can be morally obligated to someone is if they have authority over you, that we said, and so that is the biblical creator. Okay, fine. And you can't separate the biblical creator from Christianity and the church. Everybody good with these? What does that mean? Well, that quite simply means you can't separate politics from Christianity and the church. Right there, you see you cannot separate politics from Christianity and church. And anybody who says that they can is missing the entire concept of laws and protection and rights. Now, see, in other words, unloving to remove the creator. It's a creator that is the assurance that oppression does not thrive. Only a mean-spirited, ignorant, illogical person would try to remove the creator out of politics. Now, I've given this talk to secular audiences. And I say, I know exactly what you're thinking right now. You're thinking, we want a theocracy. I'm like, no, we do not want a theocracy as defined by man. Let me explain. You see, Presbyterians don't want a Baptist government. Charismatics don't want a Baptist government. Assemblies of God don't want a Baptist government. For crying out loud, Baptists don't want a Baptist government. Right? They're like, I've been to those meetings. You ever been to the SBC, Southern Baptist Convention? It's a nightmare, right? So they don't want that. Why? What we want is we don't want Christian government, a Christian government. We want Christians in government. We don't want a church government. We want a moral government. And the only way we can get there is by having Christians in legislation to instruct the government. And if that's the case, then who better to instruct the world on moral issues than pastors and Christians who love the Lord? Is it better for someone who hates God's laws to be the one making our laws, or is it better for someone who loves God's laws to make our laws? And in line with that, what sort of person should we elect? And the Bible actually tells us exactly who should we elect. And we'll talk about this in 2 weeks. Exodus 18:21, you shall select from all the people competent men who reverently fear God, men of truth, those who hate dishonest gain. You shall place these over the peoples of the leaders, as leaders, officials of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens. It's very, very simple. Okay. So now we see that framework there. But we did talk about rights. We said rights came from God. But what are rights? And now, if you've been to the VAC, you've heard me say this before, so we'll have some fun here. If you know this talk, you can answer it, answer the questions. If you don't know the talk, you're welcome to answer, but we're going to play a game here. I'm going to put rights on this side and something else on that side, okay? And I'm going to flash something on the screen, and you tell me if that's a right or something else. If you've played this game, you can't play this again. Only one time. Okay, ready? Okay. What is this? Is this a right or something else? This is the participation part, interactive part of the talk here. Okay, people are like, that's a trick question. See, folks, that is a gun. That is not a right. There is something that is related to the right. What is that? And most of you have it. That's what you're thinking. What? That's the right to bear arms. But no, notice this is very important. We don't need a Second Amendment to bear arms, do we? Do I have the right to protect myself from, does God give me the right to protect myself? Does the Bible say I have the right to protect myself? Yes. Right? It says, you shall guard your house, and the strong man comes after you, you shall protect your kin and folk and all that stuff, right? The Bible is right there. It says, yes, you have the right to protect yourself. I don't need a Second Amendment. Why was the Second Amendment written? So you can kill bad government people.
Protect your First Amendment.
Exactly. Right? So the Second Amendment is solely, it's not for hunting, it's not for self-defense, it's for killing bad government. And that's exactly what our founding fathers had done, just what? A few years prior to this. Right? So, that's the right. You have a right to your own gun. But here's the question, though. You have a right to your own gun. But when you're born, you're not entitled to be given a free gun, right? You have to buy, make, or earn your own gun. So just because you're born, are you entitled to a gun? No.
You're entitled to purchase.
You're entitled to purchase a gun, but you have to get your own gun. Or somebody can give you a gun, right? Okay. So now, how about freedom of speech? Is this a right? Some people aren't sure because I fooled them the first time. Yes, it's a right. It's a right. Okay, what about this? A printing press. You have this in the question and answer, right? Is this a right? You have a right to purchase one, but you're not entitled to be given a free printing press. Right? You need a printing press. Now, some of the kids are like, what is a printing press? I have no idea what this thing is. It's what we used to print. We used to make newspapers and print them out in pamphlets and stuff. Okay, so here's the printing press, right? When you're born, you're not entitled to be given a printing press. You have to buy your own printing press. But you need a printing press to exercise your freedom of speech, right? So that's something else. Okay, how about these? These are a bunch of them. You tell me if these are rights or something else. A home, home ownership, a job, healthcare, food, clothing, education. Trick question. There is a right in there. Do you see it? Home ownership is a right. You have the right to buy your own home. But you're not entitled to be given a home. You have to buy your own home, right? So you're like, okay, this makes sense, but how do I differentiate it? And this is how you differentiate it. There are two things. There's rights, which things that God gives you. That something else is what we call goods or services. Goods and services are the product of somebody else's labor. If anything is a product, like the printing press is the product of somebody else's labor, or the gun is the product of somebody else's labor, then you are not entitled to be given a free gun or a free printing press. Why? Because let's say you say education is a right. Where are you going to get that education from? That education will be dependent on somebody else providing the labor to give you an education. Same for food. You don't have a right to food. It's dependent on somebody else growing the food, right? Someone has to harvest it. Someone has to clean it. So the question is, if you promise education for free to somebody, where do you get that education? Now, you could capture a bunch of teachers, beat them and enslave them, and force them to teach for free. But that doesn't work either. But now, of course, we don't do that. We don't capture teachers and beat them and force them to teach for free. We don't capture doctors and beat them and force them to give you health care for free. What do instead? We don't enslave a small group of the population. Instead, we enslave the entire population and take 30% of all their labor and give it to other people. And we get away with that because we are creating enslavement in in a different way. But you see, you are not entitled to anybody else's goods and services. You have a right to your own goods, but not to somebody else's goods, because that's what we call what? Stealing. You see, our founders were not idiots. They understood that if you're promising goods to someone, you're going to have to slave some men all the time, or all men some of the time, to provide those goods that you have promised to other people. And that's why they knew the Constitution. They understood the difference between rights and goods, but today we don't understand that. And that's why they didn't write a Constitution that guaranteed goods to anybody, unless they were the fruits of your own hard work. So, just to summarize, notice the difference. Right? The right to bear arms is not a right to be given a free firearm. The right to free speech is not the right to be given a free printing press or a radio. Everybody with me on this? Everybody understand the difference? Okay, I hope you see there's a huge difference. This is critical. And anytime you vote, ask yourself, oh, look, there's a bond for a new library. What is this? Goods and services. Oh, we're going to build houses for the homeless. What is this? Goods and services. I mean, today we've got people running for office, and they're like, oh, yes, we are going to solve the homeless problem by building houses. Houses are not the problem. Okay? It's drug addiction, chemical imbalances, whole bunch of other things. That's the problem. And if you give them a house, they're going to trash it in a few days, a few months, a few years. The people who are actually homeless are so minor, and they have so many services. I used to work with an outreach ministry, and they were the people who needed food, who were out of a house, were less than 5% of the total homeless population. And there were enough services to provide them and help them and get them on their feet. What they need is jobs, and we'll talk about it in a minute. So here's the difference. Next time you vote for yourself, ask yourself, is this acknowledging a true right, or is this for goods and services? And notice, too, that the constitutions that have a Bill of Rights for education, jobs, healthcare, homes, are all what? Communist and socialist constitutions. And you know how successful they've been. They've gone bankrupt. They either go bankrupt or become oligarchies. Why? Because the goods that are granted as rights require you to enslave men fiscally or physically, that's financially or economically or physically, to ensure a continuous supply of the goods that you've promised to others. Let me say that again. It's very important. Goods that are granted as rights require you to enslave men fiscally or physically to ensure a continuous supply of the goods that you promised to others. And sooner or later, you're going to run out of those goods. Let me explain why. Now, before I get to that point, you got to understand, taxes or fees for services is fine. Somebody says, it's kind of funny. A lot of times I get into arguments with Republicans, right? I was walking around at the CPAC with a badge that said, taxation is theft, put out by Turning Point USA. And I run into this guy running for some office somewhere, I don't know, some red state, Republican. And he says, surely you don't mean that. I said, yeah, I do. He says, well, so you think taxing for roads is theft? I said, no. That's not what this says. This says taxation is theft. Fees for services is okay. You drive on the road, you pay a fee for the road. Usually with gas tax. Now, of course, with electricity, we'll have to figure that out, right? You own a piece of property, you pay a fee for the police protection, or a fee for the fire protection, or a fee for your sewage, right? And in fact, you have a bigger house, you might need more protection, so then you pay a bit more. If you live in a bad part of town, you might need even more protection, so you actually should pay more, right? Now, the question is, our property taxes are not going for our services. They're going to what? To pay for people's what? Schools and other things that have nothing to do with what we're doing. So fees for services would be okay. So that's the first thing we have to do if we want to change anything. It's like, no, if you charge a fee, it has to be actually proportional to the usage that I am taking. And that money has to go to what you're charging me for. And if you don't charge me, if you don't use that money for that, you have to return it because you didn't use it. So let's talk about why socialism doesn't work, right? We talked about goods and services, people making other people pay for goods and services. The Bible refutes socialism. Remember the 7 deadly sins? You can remember the 7 deadly sins by the acronym WASP-LEG, right? Wrath, avarice, which is greed, sloth, laziness, pride, lust, envy, and gluttony, right? These are the 7 deadly sins. So how does the Bible refute socialism? Through this list of sins. What does the Bible say? What does socialism say? Socialism says all men will work as much as they can and take as little as they need. But the Bible says we are greedy, lazy. Guess what? So will all men work as much as they can? Instead, what they do, they work as little as they need, but they're greedy because they're lazy, and then they're greedy and they take what? As much as they can. It's in nature. Socialism works only with insects. Now, it can work in families while the kids are young. But once they grow up and they're like, no, I'm not going to participate here, right? So, and if you have socialism, you end up with Venezuela. Now, you go, wait a minute. Neil, why did you pick Venezuela? Why didn't you pick Sweden? Because Sweden's not socialist. After ABBA left, they realized that, because some of you kids don't know who ABBA is. ABBA was a great band, a rock, or not even a rock group, like light music group. Yeah, disco, I guess. And they were the biggest export for Sweden. And when Sweden's tax rate went to like 99%, ABBA said, we're out of here. And Sweden said, oh, this is not working. And so now if you ask a Swedish, are you socialist? He says, no, we have some social programs, but we're not socialist. Right? But here's the problem, though. If you abandon socialism, then who takes care of the poor? Well, but Jesus said, oh yeah, this is the hungry Venezuelans hunt for dogs and cats, okay? And by the way, yeah, so this is the Sweden, right? If people are like, well, look at Sweden. Even with its slightly social programs, guess what? If we took all the states of the United States, Sweden is actually poorer, comparing GDP, than all but 12 American states. And if you look at the United Kingdom is poorer than all the U.S. states if you take their GDP, which is gross domestic. In other words, socialism, even the limited socialism that Sweden has, is not working well. So as much as they fight against socialism, it's just not working the way the standard of living is much higher. And you go, wait, there are a lot of poor people in all these states. Yes, and we're keeping them there. And I won't have time to go into this now, but we can, during the Q&A, we can talk about it. But here's the deal. People think that because Jesus says, take care of the poor. James says, true religion is taking care of the widows and orphans. So they believe that Jesus was a socialist. Somebody came on my Facebook page and said, well, Jesus said, take care of the poor, feed the poor, heal the sick. Jesus was a socialist. I'm like, really? Is that what you got from there? So I said, let's go over the story of the Good Samaritan. You see, did you know that Christians were the first ones to start charities? There were no charities before Christians started charities. I mean, you would create a charity to help your own family, but there was no charities to help somebody that couldn't help you back, right? So, all of the idea of charity comes from the story of the Good Samaritan by the Jesus said. Now, you remember the story of the Good Samaritan. A lot of times when we tell the story, people forget this guy right here, the innkeeper, right? This guy right there. You know, people ignore him. Well, so remember the story, right? The Good Samaritan is walking down the street, and he sees a poor man who has been beaten up by thugs. He goes and he picks him up, puts him on his donkey, and he takes him to this innkeeper. And the innkeeper is like, oh, okay, yeah, I'll take care of him. Are you going to pay me? He goes, yeah, here's half the money you need. The Good Samaritan says, here's half the money you need. When I come back, because I'm a socialist, I want you to pay the other half. He didn't say that, did he? No, you're right. What he says is, when I come back, I'm going to come back with some goons. They're going to have to get big sticks, beat up all the neighbors, collect money from all of them, and then we'll pay you the other half. Didn't do that. You know, actually, what he really said, and all seriousness aside, what he really said was this. He says, when I come back, I'm going to bring the IRS with badges. We're going to go knock on all the doors, show the badges, collect money, and then we'll pay you, right? What did he say? Jesus said, the Good Samaritan story says, when I come back, I, the Good Samaritan, would voluntarily pay you the rest of the money. That's the story of the Good Samaritan. There's no government involved, right? Jesus said what? You give to the poor, not force your neighbor to. You see, socialism is nothing more than forcing your neighbor to give to your favorite charity at the point of an IRS agent's gun. Loving our neighbors does not include forcing them to pay for other people. Jesus was saying it's not the state's job to take care of the poor, it's the church's job. So remember, when you make the state take care of the poor, they allocate goods as rights. And they violate the rights of the people who are working. True rights come from God. So from the Good Samaritan story, we see that it's the church who has to take care of the poor. And if you look at the history of man in the last 2,000 years, it's the church that has led the way in taking care of the poor, right? Florence Nightingale pioneered nursing, right? When I grew up in Africa, it was the missionary hospitals that were the nicest ones. It was the Christians who created many of the first clinics all over the world as missionary doctors, right? You would go, in fact, when I was in the Middle East, in Yemen, there was a government hospital. In fact, were covered under universal health care in Yemen, paid by the Kuwaiti government, mind you, right? And this, I have to tell you, it was wonderful. We would go in to see the doctor. There would be 100 people waiting in the waiting room waiting for the doctor. But the attendant would come and say, Dr. Ninen, which is my dad's name, your appointment is here. And we would walk right to the front of the line and go and see the doctor. Why? Because the doctor was an Indian. It's the only reason, right? Otherwise, we would have had to wait for those 100 people to get through. It's horrible otherwise. But when we went to the Christian hospital, the Christian missionary hospital, one, it was free. We always would give them money because we could afford it. But two, they were loving. The doctors there had spent their entire life, career, and their mission in life was to come and take care of the poor and take care of people there. So we would go there and they would say, yeah, everybody's welcome. Of course, we would give them money because we wanted to help the ministry. And it was actually a much better place to go to. So a few years ago, I was on a radio show. And normally I don't go on radio shows with liberal hosts. You know? So most of my radio shows were really conservative hosts. And so on this one show, and the guy booking me said, "Oh, you should go on this show." He said, "He's liberal, but he's really nice. He'll be really nice to you." I said, "Oh man, I don't know." He says, "Come on, you've done like 40 shows. Just do one liberal show." I'm okay, fine. So I get on the show, and I'm the first guest, you know, because usually they have like guests every 20 minutes. They'll have a different guest, make it exciting and all that. So I'm the first guest. I go on, and I do my 20 minutes. And after the 20 minutes, he says, Mr. Mama, can you stay on longer? Because I've never had this many calls come in. Because remember, he's a liberal host. So all the liberals are getting really angry and are calling in. So I said, okay, fine, sure. And he's really nice. He's really nice to me. And so all these callers call in, and they're all beating up on me. And he's protecting me. He says, no, that's not what Mr. Marvin said. Why don't you explain, right? So he's actually a really good host, right? Well, halfway through, and what's funny is, so after the first 20 minutes, he goes, Mr. Marvin, can you stay longer? In fact, I said, okay, sure. So I stayed another 20 minutes. Now we're going on an hour. And so during that break, he calls me. He says, he says, Mr. Mom, I've canceled all my other interviews. Can you just stay on for all 3 hours? I'm like, oh, man. Now, what's funny is towards the second hour, actually towards the third hour, the word gets out. Hey, John has a conservative on his radio show. We should all call in. So the third hour, all these conservatives are calling and beating up on him. And now I'm like, well, because I don't know what he said in the past. I'm not listening, but they're all beating up on him. But anyway, so halfway through the beat up on Neil part, I get a call, and the call says, well, you're a mean-spirited, evil person. I'm like, why am I mean-spirited? He says, well, because you want the poor to die. I'm like, why do I want the poor? I just told you that the church can take care of the poor. She goes, well, that's just stupid. Maybe in Africa, the church can take care of the poor. But I just went to my hospital, and they had the latest MRI scan and CAT scan equipment. You think your hospital can do that? I mean, your church can do that? I said, ma'am, can I ask you a question? She goes, what? I said, what is the name of your hospital? Long silence. I go, ma'am, can you tell us the name of of your hospital? Long silence. The host starts cracking up because he knows how this is going to end. She says, ma'am, will you tell Mr. Mom the name of your hospital? She goes, St. James, but that's not important. And I said, ma'am, most of the hospitals that you know in history were started by Christians. In fact, there's probably some board somewhere that still claims to be Christian that is in charge of it. But the reality, I mean, look, Good Samaritan, right? I mean, the reality is that most of these were started by Christians. The reason why hospitals are so expensive today is because they are forced to give away health care for free. And as Ronald Reagan said, if you want sand to be very expensive and impossible to get, have the government give it away for free. Why? Because here's what will happen. First of all, they'll be giving away sand for free. And then somebody will say, well, you can't just give away any sand, Mr. Senator. You have to grade it. What if somebody gets sick on this free sand? We have to have a government seal of approval of sand. And you can't let anybody just handle this. You have to give us the contract to take care of the sand. And you can't have people just going to the beach and picking up sand. What if they get the wrong kind of sand? All sand has to come through us. And that's what's happened to healthcare. Did you know that if you want to open up a hospital here in the valley, they won't let you because there's a limit on how many hospital beds are allowed in the valley? There's a law that prevents that from happening. Why is there a law that prevents more hospital beds? If somebody wants to start a hospital, let them. It's up to them, right? If they can't fill it, it's their problem. No. There's a law to protect the hospitals. And that's why we're having this problem. And by the way, if Christian hospitals, if a Christian organization is not responsible with their donations, because you're supposed to give to Christian hospitals, then you can just stop giving and find a better organization, right? Good luck with that. If you try that with the IRS. Oh, I don't think you're using my money correctly. We just had a speaker at the VAC, right? He's an ex-IRS agent. He was a criminal investigation agent. He started doing research on it. And one of the things he said at the thing is that the government does not need your money. He's not saying don't pay because you'll go to jail, but they don't need your money. Why? Because 1/3 of it is wasted in stupid things. 1/3 of it is never collected, because people don't think. And the other third of it doesn't actually do any real work. It goes to pay pensions and stuff. You see, it turns out that government organizations, as hard as they can't ever be efficient as charities. It's just the nature of the task. In most cases, it turns out Christian charities are 6 times more efficient than government charities. In fact, not even Christian, any charity is usually 6 times more efficient. Let me give you an example. A few years ago, I got this in the mail. It says it costs the city between $40,000 and $60,000 to care for a homeless person. It costs city team $12,000. So the mayor, Sam Liccardo, was going to speak at the VAC. And so while he was there, I brought this up. I said, I was his host. We invite people we don't agree with all the time. And I said, Mr. Mayor, I just got this in the mail. Can you explain this to me? Because he was like all about homeless. In fact, the new campaign, all about homeless. We've got to deal with the homeless. We've got to deal with the homeless. He said, where did you get those numbers from? Now, it turns out that the guy who wrote this ad was sitting in the audience. I didn't know that. And he raised his hand. He says, we got it from the city website, Mr. Mayor. he says, well, it's a good question. I'll have to have somebody look into it. Of course, we never heard back from him. I'll circle back. Yes, I'll circle back with you on that one. And then afterwards, when I was talking to the guy who wrote it, he said, you know, what I didn't forget right in the ad is after we spend the $12,000, by the way, all from private donations, not a dime comes from the government, that homeless person is off the street. After the city spends it, he says actually the number is 67,000. I was just talking to a candidate, Tyrone Wade, who's running for mayor here. He says, well, actually that number is 80,000 now, if not 87,000. Right? But after they spend that 60,000 or 87,000, that person's right back on the street the next year to spend it again. And my question to the mayor is, why are you even involved in the homeless problem? Why don't you just leave it, get out of the business, stop competing with city team, and let them do the work? I'll get back to you on that one. But this explains why socialist countries are so much poorer. They take 6 times as much labor to get the same amount of goods and services. For every dollar you give to the government in taxes for the poor, only 15 cents gets to the poor person, if you're lucky. Every time I've talked to a government agent who said that, they're like, oh, if you're lucky. But if you give $1 to a charity, 85 cents will go to the actual poor person, and if they don't, just stop giving and go to another charity. So it's actually unloving to let the government continue to be in the business of charity when we could be helped 2 to 5 times the number of needy people with the same amount of money. Now, understand we can't get there overnight, right? People will be dying in the streets. The church must first take back its leadership and resume its proper role. Now, I'm going to end with this, and then we'll go to do some Q&A and then get ready for next week. Somebody said, well, Neil, you know, that's just not realistic. I said, why? He says, well, the government spends $1.2 trillion of our budget on poor people. Do you think the church can do that? I said, yeah. And he laughed. I said, of course the church can do that. He says, how do you think the church can do that? I said, well, quite simply this. If we are 6 times more efficient, $1.2 trillion really means $200 billion off church donations. And then he laughed. He said, $200 billion. You think your church is going to raise $200 billion? I said, no, I think my church is going to raise $470 billion. Because last year, Americans get, this is a few years old, last year Americans gave $470 billion to charity, which is 9 times more than the next closest, the Germans, 11 times more than the next closest, which is the Italians. And that $470 billion was given more by individuals and not by big foundations. We just need to do 50% more, and we can take care of 30% of the entire U.S. budget. So when I was in Kansas a few years ago, in 2014, I got to travel the state of Kansas with Governor Sam Brownback. It was kind of fun. You know, we did a little show and tell. And it was great because I would see all this, Brownback's doing a dog and pony show with this guy named Neil Mauman. I'm like, okay, fine, whatever you want. And actually one week, when we were talking, there was a huge protest outside. And that turned out to be the biggest event we had because of the protest, right? So people who heard about the protest would come and listen to us. It was kind of cool. And of course, and it was the teachers' unions. They were like, oh, we want more money, right? That was what the big protest was. So there was some leftover food for Sam and I. They brought like that much food for us. And so I said, just take this food out to the protesters and invite them in. And a bunch of them came in. And it was great because we had the Q&A afterwards. And I said, is there anything I've said today, I said exactly this, that you disagree with? And there was a reporter on their side, and he asked a couple of questions. He says, and I said, I agree with you. But do you understand the rights and goods parts of it? He goes, well, yeah. So do you think that we should force people to pay? He says, I think we need to. I said, didn't I just explain why we don't need to? He says, yeah, I guess there's not much we disagree on. So the reality, when I was there, I said, look, and I got to meet with the Christian legislators, which is sad because it was in Kansas, and they had like 80 legislators, and the room had only 24 Christians, because they invited just the Christians to talk to me. There was only 24 of them. And I said, look, guys, I know you're only doing the state income tax part of it, but if you gave people 2 times the deduction for every dollar they if like, for instance, if I gave $1 to city team, you would give me $2 in deductions. You would save $6, and I would save 60 cents. I think that's a fair deal. And they said, oh, yeah, we should think about it. Of course, it never passed because there are only 24 of them, right? So, but anyway. So let's wrap this up with, and then we'll talk about a couple of things. Here's the real problem with socialism. Socialism hurts evangelization. Socialism limits the opportunity to spread the gospel because it takes away something that's the role of the church and makes it the role of government. Right? Every time somebody, every time the government meets somebody's physical needs, the church has lost its opportunity, an opportunity to witness and show Christ's love to that person. And if you look at socialist countries, the church is almost dead in all the socialist countries, right? Now, if you look at communist countries, the church is coming back again because it's the other extreme, right? Socialism is just on the path to the extreme. But here's the deal. If socialism really worked, then we would actually have no problems with it. But it turns out for the last, this is from 2003, but it continues now, the poverty rate has not really changed much, despite the trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars that we've put into it. Yeah, they're more poor now, but percentage-wise, they haven't changed. So why is the money the government putting in not changing? And if you look at before, most of the social programs started around here. You can see that it actually made things worse. And before that, as Jesus said, the poor will always be with you. And they always are. Now, it doesn't mean we shouldn't try and take care of them. I think we can reduce this number. I don't think we'll ever get rid of it because Jesus said we wouldn't. So, next week we will talk about politicians and if Jesus was involved in politics. Let's see, what time is it? It is 8:20, so we got 20 minutes. Questions? Yes, and I might defer some to next week if, yeah. Oh, hang on, Mike.
You mentioned Venezuela.
Yeah.
So how come you selected that? You didn't, in contrast to Sweden, exactly.
Yeah, so Venezuela is the worst case of what we see in socialism, right? In Venezuela, Venezuela used to be one of the richest countries in the world, beef and oil, okay? Venezuela's steaks were one of the greatest things. They were one of the richest countries in the world. And now if you look at Venezuela, they're one of the poorest countries. And the only difference between when they were the richest country and today is they went full bore into socialism. Now, I'm not saying they had a great government before, but they had a free market. And then what happened is the government took over the oil rigs, the oiling system, they took over the healthcare, they took over the economy, they took over everything, controlled the economy, and now you have people starving in the streets. And no good reason, because it's not for lack of resources, it's the greenest country in the world, not a green, so it's a very green, lush country, you can grow crops and everything. So it's got, the only thing that changes the government, and the government became socialist. So that's why I use Venezuela. It's a great example of that. Sweden, on the other hand, was socialist, and everything was going, I joke about ABBA, but it's actually one of the things. ABBA and Volvo were actually, they were leaving the country. People were fleeing the country. Business was fleeing the country, and they said, well, we can't do this anymore. And so they started turning things around. So now if you ask Swedish people, are you socialist? They'll say, no, we're not a socialist country. We have some social programs. Yeah, they have healthcare, universal healthcare, and it's going bankrupt, as always. And the problem with universal, here's the thing, I remember I was in with a group of people. It was an atheist Christian group, and I met a couple of really atheists who are now good friends of mine because I met them there. But one of the questions that came up is, because it invariably goes into this capitalism, socialism thing, right? Is, well, you know, the median age of death is higher in socialist countries. I'm like, no, it isn't. It's higher in some socialist countries, yes. Well, it's because of socialized healthcare. I'm like, yeah, no, it's not really because of that. They said, how can you prove that? I said, quite easily. The reason it's low in America is because we're dying of a particular disease. What do we die of in America? What's the biggest killer in the heart disease? What is the cause of heart disease? Eating too much. Lifestyle, right? So you're saying the richest country is dying of a rich man's disease and it's because of socialized healthcare? No. Yeah, maybe if we started starving people, they would live longer. But the other reason, and then I didn't get into this, but the other reason is because back in the 60s, the FDA came out with this food pyramid, which said carbohydrates were the best thing for you to eat. based on a faulty study that was funded by none other than the sugar industry. And now we know carbohydrates are the killer. They're what, fat doesn't turn to fat, carbohydrates turns into fat. Right? So the guys, I didn't say that part of it, but they were like, yeah, I never thought of that. Yeah. It's like, oh, rich people are dying of rich people's disease, so we should have universal health care. I'm like, do you see a problem with this? Anyway, any other questions? Great question. No, right here. Hang on. Wait for the mic.
So, I guess one question I have is, if you have like free market primarily determining what happens in society,
Yeah.
what about the need for checking, regulating,
Yeah.
kind of preventing
So,
corruption?
Great question. So what we want is a morally constrained free market. Now, you missed the first part of the talk. What is the government's job is to protect your rights only. So if you have somebody who is lying to you, someone who is forcing you, who is coercing you, what's that? That's the government's job to step in and stop that. It's not the government's job to tell you how to spend your money. Not the government's job to tell you what to spend. But there is actually another role. I also don't think that it's the government's job to protect people from bad practices in the sense that they're not supposed to, in other words, we don't need an FDA, we don't need an EPA, we don't need we don't even need permits in the city, right? The city permits are there, why? Because it protects you from somebody building your house wrong, right? That's why it's there. But we don't even need that. What we need, there's a replacement for all this that works far better than all this. And I had this big discussion with someone because he got confused. I said, the government should step in. Like if you sue somebody for building your house wrong, the government should step in and arrest that guy or force him to pay you. That's the government's role. The government's role is not to make sure that works correctly. He goes, well, then who's going to work correctly? I said, quite simply this. You go to Walmart and you buy, there's a group of people that make sure that you don't kill yourself. You go to Walmart and you buy a hairdryer. Walmart doesn't want you to die from the hairdryer, right? But the manufacturer who made it may be some tiny manufacturer somewhere in China who doesn't care if you die of the Walmart. So who's going to protect you from dying from a hairdryer? UL. You tip that thing up and it says UL. UL is a private company. Now, if UL passes a bad hairdryer and you die, UL will get sued. The guy who passed it will lose his job. But a few years ago, we had a BP oil spill, right? Millions of gallons of oil fell. The week before the oil spill, guess who inspected that oil rig? The government. And he said everything was okay. Do you think he lost his job? No.
It's even worse than that.
Say the first part.
It's even worse than that. Obama's family, the guy in Indonesia, I forget his name, they have huge amounts of investments in BP, and they never did anything to BP.
Right. That's interesting. I didn't know that.
Because Obama would have lost a lot of his money.
Yeah. So you see all this. So that's the corruption you have. But imagine if there was a private company like UL, and they went and the guy says, hey, just let this pass this time. And they would say, no, Mr. BP, our reputation's on the line. And here's the other thing. Now BP can say, but we followed the government's thing. You can't sue us beyond this thing. But if that wasn't there, BP would have gotten sued for everything they had, and every other oil company go, we are never going to let that happen again. You need the free market to do the checks and balances, and the government should never limit the punishment, and the government should not say, oh, if you obeyed all the rules, you don't get punished as much because you obey all the rules. It's like, no, boom, you got to do it, right? Over here.
So how do we figure in the cabal, the bankers that sort of, I don't know.
Yes, the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, they want to protect us.
Yes. So we, maybe once I get to Idaho, I'll do. There's a whole class that needs to be done on the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is a big scam. Just so you know, the Federal Reserve is not a government agency. It's a private banking industry. The government borrows money from the Federal Reserve. Federal Reserve just prints paper, and then we pay them for that money. We're like, we're paying you for paper? Why do you get to print money and loan it to us? So that's all nonsense. That has to go. So there's a lot of problems with that, but we'll talk about it. That's a whole talk on its own. There's a great book that if you can read it, it's this thick. It's called The Creature from Jekyll Island. Great book. We've been trying to get the author, Griffin, to come, E.W. Griffin, to come speak. But I've just, after COVID, I've just not been able. He's still alive. At least he was before COVID. Yeah, he's still alive. We use a video of his from 1950 when I teach at EBLM. We do this critical race theory. The concept of critical race theory was, he speaks about it in 1950. E.W. Griffin. So yeah, yeah, definitely good book. This thick, but it's, man, you keep reading it because it's just like wow. So.
And it basically says that it wasn't the Federal Reserve created in 1913.
Yeah.
Was done. Everyone was on Christmas break, and they didn't have a quorum, which means enough Congress people present to vote for such a huge thing. So it was basically illegal. But go tell the IRS and
Yeah.
the federal banks
So.
that. Yeah.
We'll also, we're going to bring Joe Bannister back. He was the IRS agent. We just had him speak for 30 minutes. We're going to have him give him a whole hour and a half so he can speak. Right, Tandy, and then back to Steve. Go ahead.
Actually, I was just making a comment on that. I just looked it up. And, you can get The Creature from Jekyll Island for free on audiobook.
Oh,
For yours to keep on Audible if you
if
want to.
you're a member, right?
Probably, well, it's actually probably one of those things where if you're not a member, you can get a free book.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
If there's any book you should listen to, it's, again, as I said, it's like 500-600 pages, but it's every page is just amazing. Yeah.
So what you said makes a lot of sense and seems a little idealistic, perhaps.
Yes.
How, has there ever been a time where the church has played its appropriate role, and how do you envision from today, say, that restoring what it has either been lost or never been realized from the church's appropriate role?
Well, you'll never have a perfect government just because we are human, right? And there's always going to be evil actors all over, right? Bob wants the mic after. But I think, has there ever been, I think there was a time, so you have to understand, right from the beginning, people were acting against the freedoms that Americans had. You know, I mean, most of you grew up in America, but I don't know if you realize, looking from the outside, looking in, America's an amazing experiment. No other nation had ever put in their foundational documents that rights come from God. And now they're trying to forget it. I don't know if I told you this, but a few years ago I was in Washington, D.C. at a Christian organization of lawyers, and they were talking, and there was a guy making a presentation. He says, yeah, so the Congress is, the Supreme Court has been looking at this and has been evaluating the constitutional rights and looking at the constitutionality of this law, and there's all this, and he says constitutional rights, constitutional rights, constitutional rights. So I'm like, can I ask you a question? I'm like, I'm not a lawyer, I'm just a simple engineer, but we don't really have constitutional rights because the Constitution doesn't give us any rights. And he looks at me with this. Yeah, yes, that's correct. I said, well, do the judges know this? He goes, well, if they do, they're not saying. It was just like this moment of, yeah, you're right. So even our own guys are not talking that way. So we have a lot of educating to do. And this was like 4 years ago. Mary Catherine was there. Yeah.
On the subject of medicine, if the FDA only ensured that medicines were not harmful, but you didn't have to prove they were effective, they would get on the market years and years sooner, and the market would figure out much faster if they were effective or not, and they'd be available to people much sooner than under our current system.
Right. So and that actually, so the thing is, the FDA also gives them a protection. If they were like, here's something we're releasing on the market, if people die, you're going to come sue us. So they're going to be very careful about releasing on the market, right? And they can, because here's the thing, you can't sign away your inalienable rights. They're inalienable. I can't sign a contract saying I'm going to do this and I'm going to die, right? So the Squid Games would never work in America, right? Because you can't sign away your inalienable rights. Now, you could say I'm going to die anyway, I'm willing to try this experimental drug. That's different. But you can't say, hey, I'm going to try this experimental drug, but if it kills me, you're not liable. No, you're still liable, right? So there's a bunch of things that you can go through that will protect them. And I always, because people say, well, if the FDA is there to protect us, and this is the same argument that Bob's making, and I heard this from Ron Paul, very interesting. He says, yeah, you think the FDA is protecting us, but how many people have died because the FDA was protecting them? And that's what Bob's saying, right? Over here.
Presented some numbers on charitable giving.
Yeah.
Was that per capita for the United States compared to
Yeah,
Germany?
so 9 times more. Well, when you compare per capita, and it's comparing gross domestic product versus, so basically.
Oh,
income
I
and
see.
stuff,
Okay.
yeah.
All right. Great. So why?
So it's not, obviously we give much more than Italy because we're a much bigger country, right?
Right. I understand. Yeah, you've scaled
yeah,
it to
yeah,
the
we
size,
scaled it to the
GDP.
size, yeah.
Okay. So why do you think that is the case, that the United States gives more, and how do you see it giving even more to be able to make up for that extra $200 billion?
Because okay, so let's say in an ideal case, right? I go in and I say, good, look, I'm going to give everybody a 30% tax break. I'm going to cut your taxes by 30%. You're at 30% tax bracket, you're now at 20. Right? Why? Because I've just cut the budget by 30%. Now, of course, we all know, as I just mentioned earlier, the government doesn't need our money to fund the government because they're just printing. And when we get into the Federal Reserve, you see they've got nothing. There's no relationship. The only reason taxes are there is to control people.
Really true.
It's only the reason for their control to control people. They could just print money and cause the inflation, which is what they're doing, and then blame it on Putin, which has nothing to do with that, right? So, absolutely, right? So, what was the rest of the question?
Oh, just how do you envision
Okay.
that $200 billion?
Yeah.
So,
So
you
how
answered
does
that,
so the first part is that we now give everybody a 30% tax break, and so remember if I give everybody a 2x or 3x for every dollar that goes to a real charity, not to a foundation or anything, but to a real charity that takes care of the poor. If I get a 2x or 3x tax break, I save 30. Let's say my tax rate is 30%. I save 30 cents on the dollar. So if I give $2 and I get $1, I get a $2 thing. I save 60 cents instead of 30 cents. So I've saved only 30 cents more. The government just saved $12. Sorry, $6, right? Right. So that's the way I'm thinking. Back there. This is fun.
So you might have touched on this, but given the state of the education system in the United States today, what do you think are the chances of writing things?
It's not the state of the education, it's the state of the church. Right? I think there's more chance today than before because a lot of people are pulling their kids out of public schools. So that's a good trend. If you'd asked me 3 years ago, I'm like, we're lost, right? But now with COVID and overstepping, I think people are pulling their kids. So that's one thing on the kids. But I really think also a lot of the people in the church are waking up. By the way, just reminded me, I'm going to come back to this topic on the FDA. But yeah, I think I'm very encouraged, not encouraged, I'm not discouraged by the turn of events, right? Everybody's like, oh yeah, and I may be wrong, but I'm hoping that at some point the church is going to wake up. And they haven't woken up before, but we haven't had anything this drastic happen. And when I say the church, I don't mean those wimpy pastors. I'm talking about people who are going to church and going, wait a minute. And then they go to a church that is good, right? So, but coming back to the FDA, one thing we should all know, you cannot sue a vaccine company, right? If you didn't know that, you cannot sue a vaccine company because they passed a law, and that's the first thing that if we get Congress and the presidency back, that's the first thing we have to do is to destroy that what's it called?
1986 vaccine.
Yeah. And that, sadly, Ronald Reagan signed, right? We've got to reverse that completely. We've got to reverse the Johnson Amendment. A whole bunch of these have to be reversed. And I think we can get there slowly. Now, whether we have enough real, truly believers and Republicans in Congress to do that, I don't know. Because the vaccine company has a lot of money. They make billions and billions and billions now. Oh, right here, and then we'll come back.
was Jesus a capitalist?
Absolutely. You know the story of the 10 talents? Right? Remember that? Yeah, I know you're setting me up. It's like a setup question. So it was Jesus a capitalist? Absolutely. Remember the story of the 10 talents? The master goes away and he has these servants. One he gives 10 talents, one he gives 5, one he gives 1, right? The one with 10 talents doubles it and he gets 20. He goes, you're blessed. He goes, hey, that's good. And then he goes to the one and gives him 5 and he doubles it. He goes, yes, you're blessed. And he gives him more responsibility. And he goes to the one with the one who doesn't do anything. He hides anything and he punishes him. And he takes that 1 talent and he gives it to the guy who makes 20, who has 20 now, right? And he was definitely, why? Because capitalism is, here's the thing about, so when we come back to your thing, morally restrained capitalism. You can't have unfettered capitalism because what will happen is you will get evil people taking over, exploiting. So you want morally constrained or morally restrained capitalism where the government steps in to control the evil that men would naturally do. The problem is government is evil too. And that's why the church has to step in and watch that. Now, here's what we should not forget. You can't have a monopoly without a government. So all these antitrust laws are absolute nonsense. Let me give you an example. And by the way, this is straight from Mike Winter. You know, he passed away last year, really sad. But I learned so much from Mike. It was just amazing. In fact, I wrote my book, and then I listened to Mike, and then I changed like at least 20% of my book to add all the stuff he'd given me, right? I said, oh, this is good. I got to throw it in. So, and he's with the Institute for Principled Studies. So he passed away. I think they're going to have somebody else teaching that. But so he said, here, this is the example. He says, imagine that there are 4 railway stations, railway companies, right? And east, west, north, south railway companies. And east is this old railway company. Their rail lines are dying and falling apart. The carriages are ugly, right? And so they say, you know, a ticket from New York to San Francisco is normally $100. We're going to make it $85 because we need to attract people to our falling apart railway station. Well, the north guy has the richest company, and he's the brand new things, but he's charging people $125. Well, when this guy drops his price to $85, now there's a bidding war. So all Northwest East Side, they all start, you know, they do a price war, and you know the price goes down from 85 to 84 to 83, and soon they're all losing money, right? And so they get, guys, we can't do this. So they have a meeting, which is supposedly not allowed, and they say, look, we got a price fix. Look, I know you want to charge 85, but look, you got to charge at least 97. So the guy said, okay, we'll charge 97, right? So the other guy said, okay, I'll do 115 because I've got a fancy thing and all that. But then the 85, the guy who, the East says, I'm still not making any money because nobody wants to pay 97. I got to go back to 85. So he changes the price back to 85. Now there's a big price war again, right? A fair war, and they go back and forth, and everybody's losing money, and they go, look, guys, we can't do this. And then they meet again, and they keep doing it. And finally, this happens over and over. The North guy says, I got to do something about this. So he goes to a senator, and he says, Mr. Senator, we got a problem. Look at this East guy. They need some regulations. And you have this regulation, that regulation. We can't have too many beds in Santa Clara County in hospitals. We got to have regulations that do this. We got to have these environmental. Guess what? He can pay for it because he's rich. And when the East guy tries to violate those, he either goes out of business, right? The government steps in and throws him in prison because you're violating all these regulations. And so what the rich guy says, I know I can put him out of business. It takes the government to enforce a monopoly. That's exactly what happened. Mike Winter tells the story. He says, I was in City Hall. He was a city councilman for a while, and he said, and I'll probably get the story a bit mixed up so you'll get the general idea. He says, and a lady down the street had her house worked on by a handyman, and the handyman did, you know, like $100,000 worth of damage. But handyman only needed like $10,000 worth of insurance. And he says, look, he just destroyed the lady's house. She doesn't have any money. So the head of the city council said, or not the head, one of the main guys in city council says, we need to have a $1 million policy, insurance policy for all handymen and all contractors. And Mike said, I had a small contracting company. If I had $1 million insurance, I'd be out of business. And he said, but the reason why this guy wants $1 million thing is because the other councilman who proposed it was the head of a big construction company. And by imposing $1 million, guess what? He gets rid of all his competition. It takes a government to create a monopoly. If you don't have that, everybody's competing. You have the railways doing all this stuff, all that stuff, and they'll just compete. Eventually, they'll have to say, we got to get more efficient, and they'll get more efficient. You got a monopoly. I don't care, whatever. You know, people say, well, look, Microsoft was a monopoly. And I don't like Bill Gates, but Microsoft was never a monopoly because it was $87 for a copy of Windows. You don't want Windows, you got Mac, which was more, right? Until they went down to $10 for the Mac, right? The Mac operating system was $10, right? For a while. And then, again, as a really funny story. So years ago, for those of you guys who are young, I won't even know this company. But years ago, there was a company called Sears Roebuck. Massive catalog company. I mean, before the internet, you would open up these catalogs and you'd go, oh, I want this. And you'd order it, you'd mail it in, and it would show up at your doorstep. It was like Amazon before Amazon, right? So, massive company everywhere. And Phil Donahue was a talk show host, right? And he has what's his name? Milton Friedman, who was an economist on his show. And he's doing this whole thing. And he says, Milton, surely you think small companies need to be protected. And Milton Friedman's like, what? Why would the small companies need to be protected? He said, well, look at Sears Roebuck. There's this huge, massive company. They own everything. And here's this. At that time, there's a small company called Kmart that was just starting. It was a mom and pop store. He said, there's a small Kmart. Surely we need to protect Sears from Kmart. And Milton Friedman laughs. He goes, protect Sears from Kmart? I mean, protect Kmart from Sears? You need to protect Sears from Kmart. In 2004, Kmart bought Sears. Right? The bigger they are, the slower and lumbering giants they become, and the harder it is for them to compete. But they will want the government to step in to protect them. Right? So that's why government is never good at what it does. The only thing you should do is, did you violate his rights? You're going to pay. Right? Did you not keep that contract? We're going to enforce the contract. That's the only two things they're supposed to do. And everything else, they just mess it up. Right? We're at 8:46. We can take a couple more questions. Yeah, go ahead.
So the church, like you said, the only thing that'll help is if the church wakes up.
Yeah.
How does that look? What is that?
Well, I think it looks like this, right?
But I mean, do you see people from church running for office? What
yeah.
do you?
We've seen a lot more. Well, so that's the goal of the VAC, right? To get Christians involved politically, to get them plugged in, to get them. There are a lot of other groups like us. SVRW is, even though they're not explicitly Christian, they've got Christians running it, and they've been getting board members running. They've done a great job. They're the ones that helped us do the voter guide for this year. So there are a lot of good groups out there, and we partner with all of them whenever we can. So I think we just need the church. We need people. Let's put it this way. If you're in a church that's not involved in politics, I met a friend, and I said this last week. For those of you who weren't here, I'll say it again. AB 2223, right? You all heard me say this. I'll say it again. So AB 2223 is basically child murder law, right? So I was in Sacramento. A bunch of us were in Sacramento. And a few weeks later, I saw a friend of mine from the church I used to go to. And I said, where was your pastor in Sacramento? How come none of you guys were in Sacramento? He said, well, we didn't know about it. I said, well, why didn't your pastor tell you about it? Here's a bill that says Moloch is God, and we're going to sacrifice babies on the hands of Moloch, and your pastor doesn't speak about it? You need to leave that church. Your pastor's not speaking about these things? You need to leave that church. And the funny thing is, a few years ago, this occurred to me. I said, if you don't think Christians should be involved in politics, go to your pastor and say, oh, city council is going to reduce the number of parking spots in our church. That week, the pastor will send out an email to everybody that says, everybody go to City Hall on Tuesday night and protest it. I'm like, yeah, City Hall is making decisions that kill people and hurt the innocent and the poor, and your pastor doesn't care? Right here and then back there.
Well, I also just wanted to add that you had said something about how they were trying to pass the gay conversion therapy thing, to ban that. And you had said the pastors who aren't going out there and standing for that their bookstore would be banned. That would be the first to go. Like they were gonna lose.
No, it's funny. So a few years ago, Evan Lowe was passing this gay conversion law that he wanted to pass, right? And he's right here in Campbell, right? And I sent an email to the pastors, and I said, look, if this passes, you can't sell a Bible, because they couldn't get you on teaching theology, but they could there was a commerce clause. Basically, if you sold something that banned gay conversion or spoke badly about gay conversion, then they would get you on that. And I sent an email to them, and I said, if this passes, none of you will be able to sell a Bible in your church bookstore. We had 25 pastors show up. I never had 25 pastors show up for anything before. Yeah, out of 1,000. Because the other ones didn't have bookstores in their church. That's why. Right here and then back there.
Okay, just a quick one. We saw that movie Enemies Within the Church last week, and I didn't have a sense when I left the extent to which Marxism has invaded our Christian churches. Do you have a sense of how prevalent that is?
I would say maybe not the small churches, but a lot of the bigger churches. So one of the things we teach about is critical race theory and wokeism, right? So we've seen a lot of woke churches and a lot of pressure on churches to become woke. So I think, yes, I couldn't give you a number, but I would say it's a large number, and mainly the bigger churches. The smaller churches, not as much. But I think that what will happen is as the bigger churches go woke, they'll get small, right? Just like the churches that didn't stay open. Some of the churches, I talked to a friend of mine about a church. I said, so how's your church doing after the shutdown? He goes, I think we have about 60% back. 30% of those are online. I'm like, so you still only have 30% back? I'm like, so they've lost. Forget about the online people. They've lost at least 40% of their congregation. Probably all at Calvary. That's where they're at. They're right there. And then Mike.
I had not heard about a lot of these Sacramento issues that are coming up. I was thinking maybe if every church has one person, that's his job, is to find out what's going on in Sacramento, unless you listen to Christian radio, or how do churches find out about these issues, you know?
There's a great friend of mine, a good friend of mine called Dran, Reese. She has something called Salt and Light. And we've spread that all over. I wrote about her in a book, and people called her and stuff. So basically, it's a Salt and Light ministry. They train you, and every month you host a table at your church, and they will put the latest thing in your state. So Salt and Light, I wish I knew the name, but if you send me an email, neil@noblindfaith.com, I'll make sure you get that. But it's called Salt and Light Ministries by Dran Reese. Great person. Dran's an amazing woman. So yeah. And then I think Mike. Yeah, Dran, Reese, Reese.
I was just going to say, if you don't think the movie made the point that church has moved left, then I would seriously, watch it again slowly, and also consider Catholics. We have an openly Marxist Pope. So if you consider them Christians, and I do, that's a huge change. So I just wanted to point out, obviously, and then you have all kinds of Episcopalian, all these churches that have gone dead, that used to be real churches, preaching the word of God, and now they're all either they're neutral to the issue, or they never teach anything about it, or they openly support it, and they march with them, and they have a lot of them have LGBT priests. Tests, I don't know exactly.
Yeah, if you look at what's interesting about that is as they do that, they get smaller and smaller and smaller. But they're out there. But the problem is when they get smaller, most of those people don't go to good churches. They just stop going to church.
Yeah, and the main point that is actually there's two documentaries I wholeheartedly recommend. One is by Curtis Bowers, Agenda 1, Agenda 2. And it was on their agenda, if anybody remembers, when it came to the church, their agenda was replace the discipleship making, the Great Commission, replace it, change the scope, the mission of the church from making disciples to social justice. And if you look right now, it's like, how many people know if evangelical churches, whatever, they always go to Guatemala or someplace. You know, it's cheaper to just give these people money to hire somebody local. You know, they go in there, they date, whatever, they come back.
Mission trips aren't about the people you're ministering to, it's about the people.
No, but they do a lot.
No, I'm just saying.
Yeah.
It's mostly about the people who are going.
And so if you look at that, they're not really evangelizing. It's hardly any evangelism going on. They're not evangelizing our own areas. I mean, if you look in a room, you're going to see how many, you know, the demographics. This is a little bit different, but you see a lot of, a lot of churches are basically, you know, children are losing their faith in college and so on because nobody's teaching them anything. So they have no support. So anyway, so yeah, Marxism has completely invaded the church, including the Protestant churches. But
okay. Shall we close next week? Oh, Steve has one more comment. Last one from Steve. Okay, yeah. By the way, Curtis Bowers will be here July 9th at Calvary Church, at the VAC, July 9th. Yeah.
Can I just say one more thing?
Yeah.
As old as I am, I think I have some reflections on parenthood. I wish now I had taught my children at home. I relied on the church youth leaders. I'd ask, what are you covering? And not that there's anything wrong, but I think parents are kind of to blame for the kids falling away in college, because I'm talking about myself. My children didn't, but anyway, long story. But we need to be teaching them at home. You teach them to pray. There's, not just the Bible stories, but, we parents are to blame. We teach them at home.
Yeah, absolutely.
Go through the Bible and not just devotionals.
You're responsible for your kids.
Yes.
So one thing in the first class we taught, it's called the No Blind Faith class. And I ended with create a culture of apologetics in your home. That means when kids ask questions, you need to be the one who finds the answer, not have your preacher or someone. So if they ask the tough questions, why do I know God exists? Can I trust the Bible? Did Jesus really exist? Did he really rise from the dead? All these things, you have to have the concise answer, and you can go looking for it with them. So yeah.
Not just the youth pastors, but have a meeting with the parents and say, this is what we're covering this year, and maybe just have some conferences on how to raise your child to be a Christian. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You're kind of out of the loop as a parent, at least that was my experience. I didn't know what they were covering, and you should have some meetings with the
Yeah, so definitely, parents, we encourage you to play an active part in your kids' faith. Steve, last.
So with what you were talking about, as far as a friend of mine up in Oregon is hosting this next week on June 2nd a luncheon with a bunch of pastors in Medford. And one of the recent Barna research polls has come up with a statistic that within the church, and this is with people who really claim to have a real relationship with God, evangelical Christians that really know the Lord, only about 20% of them even know what the Great Commission is. So given a test, and defining what the Great Commission is.
For those of you who aren't familiar, Great Commission is when Jesus, the last words to his apostles was, go into all the world and preach the gospel and make disciples of every nation.
Yeah, Matthew 28 is a good.
I like to quote it. The whole thing says, all authority on heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go make disciples of the whole nation, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the name of the Son and the name of the Holy Ghost, and teach them to obey all my commands. Which is something that all these great teaching churches, they're lying.
They're missing the last part.
I showed a gentleman, a brother, who's a Christian and a serious guy, and he took a picture of the screen. He was amazed. I don't know how many years he's been to the church, and I used to have this question just anecdotally, just to find out what people know. And I found out almost no one knows that this is the one mission for the church. And people are like, how do pastors have such large churches, they never bother to ask? It's like playing soccer and not knowing for 15 years.
Not knowing the rules.
And I don't know what the goal is.
Don't even know how to play the game.
Yeah.
So he's having this meeting anyway, and they did a second version of the thing where they actually gave it multiple choice. They gave you 5 options, and the percentage went up to 33%. when they were given the option of choosing one. So it's just really, but yet with the pastors that they of these same churches, they over 80% of them knew what the Great Commission was. So there's a disconnect
between what they're
what's
teaching
happening.
and
Yeah,
we actually had I have a questionnaire that I give to high schoolers, and it goes through all the theological questions, and I can't remember the answer, but it depends on which church. Some churches, if they're, and also it's hard, because we ask, are you a Christian first? So how long have you been a Christian? And then we kind of filter it through that, because if they're a visitor, obviously they're not going to know. And most of of course, there are a lot of trick questions, right? It's like, what's the opposite of God? Well, if you know your theology, there is no opposite of God, right? So we do ask things like that. And most kids who've been in the church a while time don't understand some of the key theological points, like the Trinity, things like that. So then we say, okay, this is what, and I use that to tell the leadership, hey, you've got to be covering this stuff. They're missing it. Randy, Randy Duke created the first one of those, and I just took that and modified it. So Randy's a good guy. Okay, let's close in prayer. You want last comment, and then we'll go?
I just wanted to say, everyone, after we pray, we have books in the back.
Oh, yeah.
And we have flyers for the VAC upcoming events. For everyone watching the live stream, in the description, there are links to all the books. And if you go to vac.org, you can find all the events. So thank you, and back to you, Dad.
Thanks. Okay, let's pray. Oh, Mike. Oh.
With your friends or families, read the Bible. I like apologetics, but apologetics is not going to save you. Apologetics is to support the Bible. And and we all know what happened to Ravi. So, we need to be focused on God and use apologetics as a tool. But I was going to say there's two ways to study the Bible, okay? Don't read it, please study it. One is to expository preaching, so you can look for any good preacher who does expository preaching, teaching verse by verse what it means. Because we do need teachers in the church. And secondly, you can buy a systematic theology where you can learn the Bible by topic. So you want to know, it's like the Trinity. Is the Trinity the biblical, what the Bible teaches about the nature of God, or forgiveness or love or anything like that? You can take that topic, and it takes you through all the verses in the Bible. Or the unborn. Does God has anything to say about the baby in the womb? And if you go through all the verses, you are not going to walk away confused. You'll be like, oh my gosh, there's so much that the Bible speaks very clearly about it. So two ways of doing it: expository teaching, verse by verse, and secondly, by topic. Systematic theology, I recommend Wayne Grudem.
When I was in college, I would just read through it. And it's a lot of fun, because you're like, especially when you're in debates with people. So let's close in prayer. Oh, by the way, and get into debates with people, because to me, that's how I learn. Somebody will say something, I go, I know that's not right, but I got to know why it's not right, and then I'll go do research on it. So, dear Lord, thank you for your grace and your blessing. We pray that you will continue to bless this nation and use it greatly. We are the most sending nation in the world. We're the most giving nation in the world, Lord. We pray that you will continue to let us be that way and grow in this new generation of kids and new generation of people, and open the eyes of the people so that they know that you have a job for them to do, Lord. We pray now for the people here that you give them a great week, keep them safe, and keep them healthy, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you for coming.